The blisters on Katherine Sullivan's palms had burst an hour ago, and now the wooden handle of the shovel was slick with her blood. She dug into the hard New Mexico earth behind the abandoned mining shack, each thrust of the blade sending fresh agony through her shoulders, but she couldn't stop. They would be coming for her soon, and if she didn't finish this, if she didn't make it look convincing enough, they would kill her slowly instead of quickly. The August sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly on her back as she carved out what she hoped would save her life, even if only for a few more hours. Katherine had been 22 years old for exactly 3 weeks when she watched Samuel Garrett murder his business partner in cold blood. She had been cleaning rooms at the Cimarron Hotel, saving every penny to buy passage to Santa Fe where her aunt lived, when she heard the gunshot. She should have run the other way. She should have pretended she heard nothing. Instead, she had frozen in the doorway, and Samuel Garrett's cold gray eyes had locked onto hers with the smoking pistol still in his hand. The dead man, Thomas Green, lay sprawled across the card table, blood pooling beneath his chair. "You didn't see anything," Garrett had said, his voice soft and dangerous. But Katherine's face had betrayed her horror, and Garrett was not a man who left witnesses breathing. He owned half of Cimarron, from the saloon to the general store, and he had the sheriff in his pocket. When Katherine tried to run, tried to get to the stage-coach station, 2 of Garrett's men had intercepted her on the road. They dragged her kicking and screaming to this abandoned place 5 miles outside of town, handed her a shovel, and told her exactly what they expected. "Dig deep enough for yourself, girl," the taller one had said, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Make it nice and comfortable, because you're going to be spending eternity in it. We'll be back at sundown to finish the job. Boss wants you to think about what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." They had ridden off laughing, confident she had nowhere to run. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and without a horse or water, she would die of thirst long before she reached help. So Katherine had started digging, tears streaming down her face, because at least while she was digging she was still alive. At least while her muscles burned and her hands bled, her heart was still beating. The hole was nearly 4 feet deep now, long enough and wide enough for a body. Her body. Katherine climbed out, her legs shaking, and sat on the edge of the grave she had dug for herself. The sun was lower in the sky, painting the mesas in shades of orange and purple. She had maybe an hour left, maybe 2 if she was lucky. She thought about running anyway, even though she knew it was hopeless. She thought about her mother, dead these 5 years, and wondered if there really was a heaven waiting. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. Katherine's heart seized in her chest. They were early. Garrett's men were coming back early, and she wasn't ready. She would never be ready. She scrambled to her feet, looking wildly around for any weapon, any means of defense, but there was nothing except the shovel and her own failing courage. But the rider that came around the side of the shack was alone, and he wasn't one of Garrett's men. He sat tall in the saddle atop a paint horse, a man in his mid-20s with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his worn hat. His eyes, even from a distance, were startlingly blue against his tanned face. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, dusty from travel, with a gun belt slung low on his hips. When he saw Katherine standing beside the open grave, blood on her hands and terror in her eyes, he reined his horse to a stop. "What in God's name?" he said, and his voice was rough with shock. Katherine couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, this stranger who had appeared like an apparition in the desert, and wonder if he was real or if she had already died, and this was some strange dream. The cowboy dismounted in one smooth motion and strode toward her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Up close, she could see the concern etched into his features, the way his jaw tightened as he took in the scene before him. His gaze moved from her bloodied hands to the shovel lying beside the grave, and then to the open hole itself. "Did someone make you dig this?" he asked, and there was something dangerous in his tone now, a barely leashed fury. Katherine found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "They're coming back. At sundown. They're going to kill me." "Who is?" "Samuel Garrett's men. I saw him kill someone, and now he wants me dead." The words tumbled out in a rush now, desperate and frantic. "They'll be here soon, maybe an hour, and if they find you here they'll kill you too. You need to go. You need to leave right now." The cowboy's expression hardened into something Katherine couldn't quite read. He looked at the grave again, then back at her, and something seemed to settle in him, some decision made in the space of a heartbeat. "What's your name?" he asked. Katherine Sullivan." "I'm Ethan Turner," he said, and then he bent down, grabbed the shovel, and began filling in the grave. "What are you doing?" Katherine gasped, but Ethan didn't stop. "Saving your life," he said simply. "If they come back and this hole is filled, if you're gone, they'll have to track you. That buys us time." He worked with an efficiency born of years of hard labor, his muscles moving beneath his shirt as he shoveled the dirt back into the hole. "Where's the nearest town besides Cimarron?" "Springer," Katherine said, still frozen in shock. "Maybe 15 miles east. Can you ride?" "I can try." Ethan paused in his work just long enough to look at her, really look at her, and Katherine felt something shift in the air between them. His blue eyes held hers for a moment that seemed to stretch, and she saw something there beyond just concern for a stranger. She saw recognition, as if he had been looking for her without knowing it, and had finally found what he sought. "Then we ride," he said, and returned to his work with renewed vigor. The grave was half filled when Ethan suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of horses, multiple horses moving fast. "No time," Ethan said, dropping the shovel. He grabbed Katherine's hand, ignoring her sharp intake of breath as his calloused palm pressed against her blisters, and pulled her toward his horse. "We go now." He mounted in one fluid motion and then reached down, grasping Katherine beneath her arms and lifting her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all. She had barely settled onto the horse's back, her arms wrapping instinctively around Ethan's waist, when he kicked the paint into motion. They rode hard away from the shack, heading east toward the rising evening stars. Behind them, Katherine could hear shouts as Garrett's men discovered the scene, could hear the confusion in their voices as they tried to understand where their victim had gone. But by then, Ethan's horse was flying across the desert floor, sure-footed and swift, and the abandoned mining shack was disappearing into the distance. Katherine pressed her face against Ethan's back, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing even as they raced for their lives. She didn't know this man. She had no idea why he had stopped to help her, why he was risking his own life for a stranger. But she held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had been crumbling beneath her feet. They rode for an hour before Ethan finally slowed the horse to a walk, leading them into a small canyon where red rock walls rose on either side, and a thin stream trickled along the bottom. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Ethan dismounted and then helped Katherine down, his hands gentle despite their size and strength. "Let me see your hands," he said. Katherine held them out, and in the fading light she could see how bad they really were. The blisters had torn open, leaving raw, bleeding flesh exposed. Dirt and grime caked her palms, and her fingers trembled from exhaustion and shock. Ethan led her to the stream and knelt beside it, gently guiding her hands into the cool water. Katherine hissed at the sting, but he held them steady, carefully washing away the blood and dirt. He worked with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance, his touch careful and sure. "I have some salve in my saddlebag," he said quietly. "It's not much, but it'll help keep infection away." "Why are you doing this?" Katherine asked, her voice breaking. "You don't even know me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, still holding her hands in the stream. When he finally looked up at her, his blue eyes were shadowed but intense. "My sister," he said finally. 3 years ago, she witnessed something she shouldn't have in Dodge City. The man responsible sent his thugs after her, just like what happened to you. But nobody stopped to help her. Nobody filled in her grave. His jaw tightened, and Katherine saw the old pain flash across his face. She was 19 years old. Her name was Mary. Understanding crashed over Katherine like a wave. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I wasn't there," Ethan continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I was working a cattle drive in Texas, and by the time I got word and made it back, it was too late. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to stop something like that from happening again, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't let another woman die because good men did nothing." He lifted her hands from the water and dried them carefully on a cloth from his saddlebag, then applied the salve with the same gentle touch. His fingers were warm against her skin, and Katherine found herself watching his face, the way concentration softened his features, the way a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. "I was heading to Colorado," Ethan said as he worked. "Got a job waiting for me at a ranch up there. But that can wait. First thing tomorrow, we get you somewhere safe." "Springer isn't safe," Katherine said. "Garrett has connections all over New Mexico territory. He'll send word out, offer a reward. Someone will recognize me eventually." "Then we go farther," Ethan said simply. He finished bandaging her hands with strips of clean cloth and sat back on his heels. "We go to Colorado like I planned. I've got a friend in Trinidad who works for the railroad now. He can get you passage to Denver or California if you want, somewhere Garrett can't reach." "That would take weeks," Katherine protested. "You said you have a job waiting." "Jobs can wait. Your life can't." He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her gently to her feet. "Right now, you need to eat something and rest. We'll figure out the details in the morning." Ethan built a small fire using deadwood from the canyon, keeping it low and hidden between the rocks so the light wouldn't carry far. He had jerky and hardtack in his saddlebag, not much of a meal, but Katherine ate it gratefully. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, and in its flickering light, Katherine studied the man who had saved her life. Ethan Turner was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, with strong features and those striking blue eyes. But it was more than his appearance that drew her attention. It was the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he seemed utterly at ease even in this dangerous situation. It was the gentleness in his hands when he tended her wounds, contrasting with the hardness in his voice when he spoke of his sister. "Tell me about her," Katherine said softly. "About Mary." Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, sending small sparks spiraling into the night. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he began to speak. "She was stubborn as a mule," he said, and there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. "Our parents died when she was 10 and I was 16, cholera outbreak in Missouri. We didn't have any other family, so I took work where I could find it, trying to keep us fed. Mary was smart, learned to read and write real well. She wanted to be a school teacher." He paused, staring into the flames. "She would have been good at it too. She was patient, kind. She saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it." "She sounds wonderful," Katherine said. She was. Ethan's voice was thick with old grief. "The man she witnessed, he was a banker named Crawford. She saw him embezzling from the bank's clients, saw him doctoring the books. She thought if she went to the marshal, justice would be done. She thought the law would protect her. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. The marshal was in Crawford's pocket. 2 days later, she disappeared. They found her body a week after that, buried in a shallow grave outside of town. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." "I tracked down the men who did it," Ethan said, and now his voice was hard as stone. "All 3 of them. I made sure they faced justice, legal or otherwise, but it didn't bring Mary back. Nothing could bring her back." He finally looked up at Katherine, and in his eyes she saw both pain and determination. "But I can make sure what happened to her doesn't happen to you. I can do that much." The night air was growing cold, and Katherine pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Ethan noticed and immediately stood, retrieving a blanket from his saddle roll and bringing it to her. He draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "You should try to sleep," he said. "We'll need to move at first light. What about you?" "I'll keep watch. Just for tonight, until I'm sure we weren't followed." Katherine wanted to protest, wanted to tell him he needed rest too, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. The terror of the day, the desperate digging, the frantic ride through the desert, all of it crashed over her at once. She lay down near the fire, wrapped in Ethan's blanket that smelled of leather and sage and something uniquely him, and within minutes she was asleep. She woke once in the deep hours of night and saw Ethan sitting across from her, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small camp. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely any light, but she could still make out his profile against the stars. He looked like something out of a story, a guardian standing watch against the darkness. She thought about calling out to him, but sleep pulled her back down before she could form the words. When Katherine woke again, it was to the smell of coffee and the pale light of dawn. Ethan was crouched by a newly built fire, a small pot balanced on rocks above the flames. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes, but he smiled when he saw her stirring. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's almost ready." Katherine sat up, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. She felt like she had been trampled by horses, her shoulders and back stiff from the digging, her hands throbbing beneath their bandages. "How are your hands?" Ethan asked, as if reading her thoughts. "They hurt," she admitted. "That's good. Means they're not infected yet. We'll change the bandages after you eat." The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was warm, and Katherine wrapped her sore hands around the tin cup gratefully. Ethan had managed to catch a rabbit at some point during the night, and he roasted strips of meat over the fire. It was the best meal Katherine had tasted in days. "We need to talk about what comes next," Ethan said as they ate. "I figure we're about 20 miles from Springer now. We can skirt around it, stay off the main roads, and head northeast toward Trinidad. It's about 100 miles, maybe 5 or 6 days of travel if we take it careful." "That's a long time," Katherine said. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." His tone left no room for argument. "But I need to know what you want, Katherine. Where do you want to go after we reach Trinidad? Do you have family somewhere, people who can take you in?" Katherine thought of her aunt in Santa Fe, the one person she had left in the world. But Santa Fe was in New Mexico territory, too close to Cimarron, too close to Samuel Garrett's reach. "I have an aunt in Santa Fe," she said slowly. "But I don't think I can go there. Not yet. Not until Garrett stops looking for me." "Then we go to Colorado," Ethan said decisively. "I know people in Denver. The railroad's hiring, and there's always work for women in the hotels and restaurants. You could start over there, build a new life." The thought both terrified and thrilled her. A new life, far away from the horror of Cimarron, far away from Samuel Garrett and his cold, murderous eyes. but it also meant leaving behind everything she had ever known, starting over as a stranger in a strange city. "What about you?" she asked. "Your job." "Like I said, jobs can wait. Getting you to safety comes first." He met her eyes across the fire. "After that, well, we'll see." There was something in the way he said it, something in the intensity of his gaze that made Catherine's heart beat faster. She barely knew this man, had met him less than 24 hours ago, but already she felt connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. He had saved her life, yes, but it was more than that. It was the way he looked at her, like she mattered, like her life had value beyond just being a witness or a victim. They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, Ethan carefully extinguishing the fire and scattering the ashes. He helped Katherine mount the horse, his hands steady on her waist, and then swung up behind her this time. "I want you in front," he explained. "If we run into trouble, I can shoot without you being in the way." Katherine settled into the saddle, feeling the solid warmth of Ethan behind her, his arms coming around on either side as he took the reins. It felt intimate, almost unbearably so, and she found herself hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched. They rode northeast, keeping to the rough country away from the main trails. The land was beautiful in its harshness, all red rock and scrub brush, with mountains rising in the distance like purple shadows. Ethan seemed to know the country well, navigating arroyos and canyons with practiced ease. As they rode, they talked. Ethan told her about his life as a cowboy, about the long cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, about sleeping under the stars and working from dawn to dusk. He told her about learning to rope and ride from a Mexican vaquero when he was just a boy, about his father who had been a farmer in Missouri before the fever took him. Katherine told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her father who had been a clerk until he drank himself to death, about her mother who tried to hold the family together until consumption claimed her. She told him about coming to New Mexico Territory 2 years ago, hoping for a fresh start, about the hard work at the hotel and her dreams of someday having a little shop of her own. "What kind of shop?" Ethan asked. "A dress shop, maybe, or a bakery?" Katherine felt herself relax against him as they talked, the rhythm of the horse's gait soothing. "I make good biscuits. My mother taught me before she died. I'll have to taste these famous biscuits someday," Ethan said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. The first day passed without incident. They saw no other travelers, no signs of pursuit. As evening approached, Ethan found another sheltered spot to make camp, this time in a grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. The water was cold and clear, and Katherine washed her face and arms, careful of her bandaged hands. Ethan changed her bandages as the sun set, checking the wounds carefully. The salve had helped, and though her palms were still raw and painful, they showed no signs of infection. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and Katherine found herself studying his face as he worked. "You're good at this," she said softly. "Had to be. When you're on a cattle drive, you're often days from the nearest doctor. You learn to patch yourself and your friends up, or people die from things that shouldn't kill them. Have you been a cowboy your whole life?" "Since I was 16, after my parents died. It was the only work I could find that paid enough to support Mary and me. I'm good at it, and I don't mind the hard work. But sometimes I think about settling down, having a spread of my own. Nothing fancy, just enough land for some cattle and horses. A house with a real roof instead of sleeping on the ground." He tied off the last bandage and looked up at her. "What about you? What do you dream about?" Katherine felt her breath catch. His eyes were so blue, even in the fading light, and the way he was looking at her made her feel like she was the only person in the world. "I dream about being safe," she said honestly. "About not having to look over my shoulder, about having a place that's mine where nobody can hurt me. You'll have that, Ethan said with quiet conviction. I promise you, Katherine, you'll have that. That night, after they had eaten and the fire burned low, Ethan offered to teach her to shoot. He had noticed she flinched every time there was an unexpected sound, and he wanted her to have a way to defend herself. If something happens to me, he said, if we get separated, I need to know you can protect yourself. Katherine's hands were too sore to hold a gun properly, but Ethan showed her anyway, walking her through the mechanics of loading and firing his revolver. He stood behind her, guiding her arms into position, his voice low and patient in her ear. Steady now. Don't jerk the trigger, just squeeze it gentle. That's it. When she finally pulled the trigger, the gun's report echoed off the canyon walls, and the tin can Ethan had set up 20 feet away went flying. Katherine jumped at the noise, but she was grinning. I hit it. You're a natural, Ethan said, and the pride in his voice made her feel 10 feet tall. They practiced until it was too dark to see, and then Ethan took the gun and carefully cleaned it, showing Katherine each step. She watched his hands move with practiced efficiency, and found herself wondering what those hands would feel like touching more than just her wounded palms. The thought made her blush, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid her face. That night, Ethan insisted she take the blanket again, and this time Katherine insisted he share it. They lay on opposite sides of the fire, each wrapped in half of the blanket, and Katherine fell asleep watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the sound of Ethan's steady breathing. The days fell into a pattern as they made their way northeast across the territory. They would rise at dawn, eat a simple breakfast, and ride until noon. Then they would rest during the hottest part of the day, finding shade where they could, before riding again until evening. At night, they would make camp, and Ethan would hunt or fish for their dinner while Katherine tended the fire and worked on healing her hands. And as they traveled, something shifted between them. What had started as a rescue, a stranger helping someone in desperate need, was becoming something else entirely. Katherine found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, admiring the way he moved, the quiet strength in him. She noticed the way he always made sure she had the softer ground to sleep on, the way he gave her the larger portion of food even though he was the one doing most of the physical work. Ethan, for his part, seemed increasingly reluctant to let Katherine out of his sight. When she went to fetch water from a stream, he would follow, his hand never far from his gun. When she woke from nightmares about Samuel Garrett and the open grave, she would find Ethan already awake, watching over her with concern in his eyes. On the third day of their journey, they crested a ridge and saw a small settlement in the valley below. It was barely more than a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads, but it had a general store and what looked like a blacksmith. We need supplies, Ethan said, but we need to be careful. Garrett could have sent word out by now, offered a reward. They approached the settlement carefully, Ethan keeping his hand near his gun. The general store was run by an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered face. He looked at Katherine with her bandaged hands and travel-stained dress, then at Ethan with his protective stance, and seemed to understand without needing to be told. "Passing through?" the old man asked. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied. "Might want to move along quick then." Had some men come through yesterday, asking about a young woman traveling alone, offered $50 for information. The store owner met Ethan's eyes. "I told them I hadn't seen anybody matching that description, figured it wasn't any of my business." "We appreciate that," Ethan said quietly. They bought what they needed: more food, fresh bandages, ammunition, and left within 20 minutes. But the encounter left them both shaken. $50 was a fortune to most people, enough to turn even honest folk into informers. "We need to move faster," Ethan said once they were safely away from the settlement. "And we need to be more careful. From now on, you stay out of sight when we're near people." That night, they camped in a box canyon with only one entrance, and Ethan insisted on standing watch the entire night. Katherine woke several times to find him pacing the perimeter, his rifle in hand, and each time she felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He was wearing himself down protecting her. On the fourth day, they crossed into Colorado territory. The landscape was beginning to change, becoming greener as they climbed into higher elevations. Pine trees appeared on the hillsides, and the air grew cooler and sweeter. "We're about a day out from Trinidad," Ethan said as they made camp that evening beside a clear mountain stream. "Tomorrow we'll reach the town, and I can get you on a train to Denver." Katherine should have felt relieved. She should have been thrilled to be so close to safety, to starting her new life far from Samuel Garrett's reach. But instead, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. Once they reached Trinidad, once she got on that train, she would never see Ethan Turner again. He would go to his ranch job in Colorado, and she would disappear into Denver, and this strange, intense connection between them would be broken. "What will you do?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. After, Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I don't know," he admitted. "The smart thing would be to take that job, start building the life I've been planning. But the thought of just leaving you in Denver, of never knowing if you're safe or happy or—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know if I can do that." Katherine's heart was pounding. "Ethan." He looked up at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes took her breath away. "I know we've only known each other a handful of days. I know this is probably crazy. But Katherine, I can't stop thinking about you. When I sleep, when I wake, when we're riding. You're all I think about. The thought of saying goodbye, of never seeing you again, it feels wrong. It feels like I'd be losing something precious before I even had a chance to understand what it was." Katherine moved around the fire, her bandaged hands trembling, and knelt beside him. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I've been terrified to say it, terrified that maybe I was just confused because you saved me. But it's more than that. You make me feel safe in a way I've never felt before. You make me feel like I matter, like my life has value, when I think about getting on that train and never seeing you again." She couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan reached up, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. "Then don't get on the train. Not alone. Come with me to the ranch. The owner is always looking for help, and he's a good man. You'd be safe there, and we could." He hesitated. "We could see where this goes, whatever this is between us." "Are you sure?" Katherine asked, even as hope bloomed in her chest. "You don't have to do this. You've already done so much for me." "I'm not doing it because I have to," Ethan said fiercely. "I'm doing it because I want to. Because in 5 days, you've become more important to me than anything else in this world. Because when I imagine my future now, I can't imagine it without you in it." Katherine felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than fear. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them testing this new territory. But then Ethan's arms came around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened. It was like coming home, like finding something she hadn't known she was looking for. Katherine wound her arms around his neck, ignoring the pain in her hands, and kissed him like he was the air she needed to breathe. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you," he said softly, "I'll keep you safe. I'll build you that life you dream about, where you never have to be afraid again. I'll give you everything I have, everything I am, if you'll let me." "Yes," Katherine whispered. "Yes to all of it." They held each other as the fire burned down and the stars emerged overhead, and for the first time since that terrible moment in the hotel when she witnessed Samuel Garrett commit murder, Katherine felt truly safe. The next morning they rode into Trinidad together, not as a rescuer and rescued, but as something more. Something that had the potential to become everything. Trinidad was a bustling town, far larger than Cimarron, with the railroad running through its heart. Ethan's friend, a man named Jack Morrison, worked as a supervisor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. He was a big man with a booming laugh and a warm handshake, and he lit up when he saw Ethan. "Turner, about time you showed up. I was starting to think you got lost." Then Jack noticed Katherine, and his expression shifted to one of curiosity and understanding. "And who's this?" "This is Katherine Sullivan," Ethan said, and the way he said her name with such warmth and pride made her heart skip. "She's going to be coming with me to the Rocking T Ranch." Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. "Well, any friend of Turner's is a friend of mine. You folks need anything." They spent the afternoon in Trinidad getting supplies and information. Jack confirmed that Samuel Garrett had indeed sent word out about Katherine, but the reward notices had only reached as far as Santa Fe. Here in Colorado, she was unknown and safe. "Still," Jack warned, "you'll want to be careful for a while. Keep your head down, use a different name if anyone asks. These things have a way of spreading." They left Trinidad at dusk, riding west into the mountains toward the Rocking T Ranch. Ethan told Katherine about the ranch as they traveled, about the owner, Thomas Reeves, who had built it from nothing 30 years ago. Reeves was in his 60s now, still sharp as a tack, and he ran a tight operation with about 30 cowboys working for him year-round. "I worked for him 5 years ago during a cattle drive," Ethan explained. "He liked my work and told me if I ever wanted a permanent position, I should come find him. The job he offered is as head wrangler. It's good pay, steady work, and it comes with a cabin on the property." "A cabin?" Katherine asked, her voice rising with hope. "Nothing fancy, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. There's a bed, a stove, a table. It's meant for the head wrangler and his family if he has one." Ethan's arms tightened around her waist. "I'm hoping you'll share it with me. Not right away," he added quickly. "We can take things slow, do this properly. But eventually, if you'll have me, I'd like that cabin to be ours." Katherine turned in the saddle to look at him, nearly unseating them both. Ethan caught her with a laugh, steadying her. "I'd like that too," she said, her eyes shining. "I'd like that more than anything." They reached the Rocking T Ranch 2 days later, riding through a valley so beautiful it took Katherine's breath away. Green meadows stretched between pine-covered hills, with a crystal stream running through the center. The main ranch house was a sprawling log structure, and scattered around it were bunkhouses, barns, corrals, and several smaller cabins. Thomas Reeves came out to meet them, a tall man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Ethan, then at Katherine, and a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "So you finally decided to take me up on my offer," Reeves said, shaking Ethan's hand. "And you brought company." "This is Katherine," Ethan said. "She'll be staying with me if that's acceptable." Reeves studied Katherine for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. But when he spoke, his voice was kind. "I've learned not to pry into people's pasts," he said. "What matters to me is, can you work hard, can you be trusted, and will you honor your commitments? Ethan, I already know the answer to those questions for you. Miss Katherine, I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. The wife could use help up at the main house if you're interested. She runs the kitchen and the household, and she's always complaining about being short-handed." "I'd be grateful for the work," Katherine said. "Then it's settled." Ethan, your cabin is the one on the south end near the horse barn. Get yourself settled in and we'll talk details tomorrow. The cabin was small but sturdy, built of logs chinked with mud. Inside was exactly what Ethan had described, simple furniture and a pot-bellied stove, but it was clean and dry. There were windows that let in the afternoon light, and from the doorway, Katherine could see the meadow stretching out toward the mountains. "It's perfect," she breathed. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "It's home," he said simply. "Our home if you want it." Katherine turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and affection and growing love into it. When they broke apart, Ethan was smiling. "I'll take that as a yes." The first few weeks at the Rocking T were a blur of hard work and new experiences. Ethan threw himself into his job as head wrangler, working with the ranch's horses and coordinating the Cowboy's work. He was good at it, Katherine realized, watching him work. The men respected him, listened to him, and even the most stubborn horses seemed to gentle under his hands. Katherine worked in the main house under the guidance of Elizabeth Reeves, Thomas's wife. Elizabeth was a plump, warm-hearted woman in her 50s who took Katherine under her wing immediately. She taught Katherine how to cook for a ranch full of hungry cowboys, how to preserve food for the winter, how to manage the household accounts. "You're a quick learner," Elizabeth said approvingly one afternoon as Katherine kneaded bread dough. "And you're not afraid of hard work. That's rare these days." In the evenings, Katherine and Ethan would return to their cabin, exhausted but content. They would eat dinner together, simple meals that Katherine prepared, and then sit on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked about their days, about the horses Ethan was training or the recipes Elizabeth had taught Katherine. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, Katherine's head on Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and slowly, carefully, their relationship deepened. Ethan courted her properly, despite them living in the same cabin. He brought her wildflowers he found while riding the range. He carved her a set of hair combs from pine wood, spending his evenings meticulously shaping and polishing them. He wrote her letters even though they saw each other every day, leaving them on the table for her to find in the morning, expressing in writing what he sometimes struggled to say aloud. Katherine, for her part, showed her affection in the way she cared for their home, in the meals she prepared with love, in the way she mended his clothes and listened to his stories. She learned to ride properly, and on Sundays, their one day off, they would explore the ranch's vast territory together, discovering hidden meadows and clear streams. 3 months after they arrived at the Rocking T, as autumn painted the aspens gold and the air turned crisp, Ethan took Katherine to a spot he had found, a hilltop overlooking the entire valley. The sun was setting, turning the sky into streaks of orange and purple and pink. He knelt before her, taking her hands carefully. Her palms had healed completely by now, leaving only faint scars, but he still treated them with reverence. "Katherine Sullivan," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I've spent my whole life drifting, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. But then I found you, and suddenly I understood what home really meant. It's not a place. It's a person. It's waking up next to you every morning and falling asleep beside you every night. It's building a life together, sharing the good times and weathering the hard ones side by side." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone. "I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but I feel like I've been looking for you my whole life. Will you marry me, Katherine? Will you let me spend the rest of my days making you happy, keeping you safe, loving you with everything I have? Katherine was crying, tears streaming down her face as she nodded frantically. "Yes," she managed to choke out. "Yes, Ethan, of course yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was standing, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, thoroughly, a kiss full of promise and passion and devotion. They were married a month later in Trinidad's small church, with Jack Morrison standing up as Ethan's best man and Elizabeth Reeves as Katherine's matron of honor. It was a simple ceremony, but Katherine had never been happier. She wore a dress that Elizabeth had helped her make, pale blue calico with lace at the collar and cuffs. Ethan wore his best clothes, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, the look on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Thomas Reeves gave them 3 days off for a honeymoon, which they spent at a small cabin further up in the mountains. Those 3 days were a blur of passion and tenderness, of learning each other's bodies and souls, of whispered declarations and promises made in the darkness. When they returned to the ranch, it was as husband and wife, and the cabin that had been their home became truly theirs. Katherine threw herself into making it perfect, sewing curtains for the windows, braiding rugs for the floor, planting a small garden near the door. Ethan added shelves and a better table, and together they slowly transformed the simple structure into something that reflected them both. Winter came to the Colorado mountains, bringing snow that piled high against the cabin walls and turned the ranch into a frozen wonderland. The work was harder in winter, but Katherine loved it anyway. She loved the way Ethan would come home covered in snow, his cheeks red from the cold, and she would warm him with hot coffee and warmer kisses. She loved the long evenings when they would sit by the stove, Katherine mending or knitting while Ethan read aloud from one of the few books they owned. It was in late January, nearly a year after Ethan had found her digging her own grave in the New Mexico desert, that Katherine realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling Ethan. She chose a Sunday evening after they had returned from a ride up into the hills. She had prepared his favorite meal, venison stew with fresh bread, and as they sat down to eat, she took his hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling with excitement and nervousness. Ethan immediately looked concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything is wonderful." She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Ethan, in the summer, probably August." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, growing wider and brighter until he was grinning like a fool. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "We're going to have a baby," Katherine nodded, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We're going to be parents." Ethan stood abruptly, pulling Katherine up and into his arms. He held her carefully as if she might break, and she could feel him shaking with emotion. "I love you," he said into her hair. "God, Katherine, I love you so much. I promise I'll be a good father. I'll protect this child the way I protect you. I'll give them everything, every opportunity, every bit of love I have." "I know you will," Katherine whispered. "You're going to be an amazing father." The pregnancy was not easy. Katherine suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and as summer approached and her belly swelled, the heat made her uncomfortable. But Ethan was there for every moment, patient and attentive. He took over more of the household chores, insisted she rest when she was tired, and held her when the fears about childbirth threatened to overwhelm her. Elizabeth Reeves proved invaluable, having raised 5 children of her own. She coached Katherine through the pregnancy, teaching her what to expect, easing her fears. She recruited a midwife from Trinidad, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen who had delivered hundreds of babies. On a sweltering August afternoon in 1879, as a thunderstorm rolled through the mountains, Katherine went into labor. Ethan paced outside the cabin like a caged animal while Elizabeth and Mrs. Chen attended to his wife. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning, and Ethan aged years in those hours, listening to Katherine's cries and unable to help her. But when the sun finally rose, so did the sound of a baby's cry. Mrs. Chen emerged from the cabin, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Turner, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife is tired but doing well." Ethan burst into the cabin to find Katherine propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. He approached slowly, reverently, and when Katherine pulled back the blanket to reveal their son's face, Ethan's breath caught. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were blue like his father's. He was perfect, tiny and red and absolutely perfect. "Do you want to hold him?" Katherine asked softly. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Katherine carefully placed their son in his arms, and Ethan stared down at the baby with an expression of pure wonder and fierce protectiveness. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa. And I promise you, I will always keep you safe. You and your mama, you're my whole world." They named him Thomas Ethan Turner, after the ranch owner who had given them their start and after his father. They called him Tommy, and he became the center of their universe. The years that followed were full and happy. Tommy grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. When he was 3, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Mary, after Ethan's sister. 2 years after that came another son, James. Ethan thrived at the rocking tea, and when Thomas Reeves began to slow down in his 70s, he made Ethan his foreman, second in command of the entire operation. It was a position of great responsibility and trust, and Ethan handled it with the same dedication he brought to everything he did. Katherine's skills in the kitchen became legendary among the ranch hands, and when Elizabeth Reeves's health began to fail, Katherine gradually took over management of the household. She proved to have a head for numbers and organization, and she worked alongside Ethan to help make the ranch more profitable. They never forgot where they came from, the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. Once a year, on the anniversary of the day Ethan had found Katherine digging her own grave, they would ride up to their special hilltop and talk about how far they had come, how blessed they were, and they were blessed. Despite the hardships of ranch life, despite the harsh winters and the occasional lean years, they built something beautiful together. Their cabin was expanded into a proper house as their family grew. Their children grew up surrounded by love and nature, learning to ride and work and value honest labor. When Tommy was 10 years old enough to understand, Katherine and Ethan sat their children down and told them the story of how they met. They told them about Samuel Garrett and the grave and the desperate ride across the desert. They told them so the children would understand the value of courage, of standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous, of helping those in need even when it's inconvenient. "Your father saved my life," Katherine told her children, looking at Ethan with eyes still full of love after all these years. "But more than that, he gave me a life worth living. He gave me all of you." Tommy looked at his father with new respect. What happened to the bad man? The one who wanted to hurt Mama? Ethan exchanged a glance with Katherine before answering. They had wondered when this question would come. "Samuel Garrett died about 5 years after we came to Colorado," Ethan said carefully. "Not by my hand or anyone else's. He got into a fight with another powerful man, and this time he lost. Justice has a way of catching up with people eventually. It was true. They had heard through Jack Morrison that Garrett had been killed in Santa Fe, shot by a deputy marshal he had tried to bribe. The threat that had hung over them for so long had finally ended, though by then they had built a life so far removed from Cimarron that it hardly mattered anymore. As the years passed and their children grew, Ethan and Katherine grew older together, their love deepening rather than fading. They weathered hard times, droughts and harsh winters, illness and injury, but they weathered them together, their bond unbreakable. When Thomas Reeves died at the age of 78, he left the Rocking T Ranch jointly to Ethan and his oldest son, recognizing that Ethan had been like a son to him and that he had no heirs of his own. It was both an honor and a responsibility, but Ethan was ready for it. With Katherine by his side managing the business aspects and their oldest son Tommy learning the operations, the ranch continued to thrive. On a warm summer evening, when Ethan was 48 and Katherine 45, they sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children were grown now, Tommy running the day-to-day operations of the ranch, Mary married to a good man in Trinidad, James working as a deputy marshal in Denver. They had 8 grandchildren between them, and the house that had once held just 2 people was often filled with the noise and laughter of family gatherings. Katherine leaned against Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her waist, just as they had sat so many times over the years. "Do you ever think about that day?" Katherine asked softly. "The day you found me." "Every day," Ethan replied. "I think about what a miracle it was, being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. If I had been an hour earlier or an hour later, if I had taken a different trail." "But you didn't," Katherine said. "You were exactly where you needed to be." "I was looking for something," Ethan mused. "I didn't know what, but I felt it. I had this restlessness, this feeling that my life was supposed to be more than just drifting from job to job. And then I saw you, and everything clicked into place." Katherine turned to look at her husband, at the gray threading through his dark hair, at the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was still handsome to her, still the cowboy who had saved her life and filled in her grave and taken her away from danger. "You gave me everything," she said. "A home, a family, a life I never dreamed I could have. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Ethan corrected gently. "You gave me purpose, Katherine. You gave me a reason to build something lasting instead of just wandering. You gave me love and children and a home. We saved each other." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a beautiful life from the ashes of tragedy. Years later, when Katherine and Ethan were in their 70s and their grandchildren had grandchildren of their own, they would still sit on that same porch, holding hands and watching the sunset. And sometimes, when the light was just right, Katherine would look at Ethan and remember the cowboy who had ridden out of the desert like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to say. And Ethan would look at Katherine and remember the brave woman digging her own grave, refusing to give up even in the face of certain death. And he would thank God for the chance meeting that had changed both their lives forever. The Rocking T Ranch prospered under the Turner family's stewardship, becoming one of the most successful operations in southern Colorado. And at its heart, always, was the love story of 2 people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together. When Katherine was 78, the same age Thomas Reeves had been when he died, she passed away peacefully in her sleep with Ethan holding her hand. She was surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a woman who had been loved deeply and had loved deeply in return. Ethan lived for 2 more years, but everyone said he was never quite the same without his Katherine. He would sit on the porch of their house, talking to her as if she were still there, telling her about the grandchildren and the ranch and how much he missed her. When Ethan Turner died at the age of 80, he was buried beside Katherine on the hilltop where he had proposed, overlooking the valley they had called home for more than 50 years. At his funeral, their children and grandchildren told the story of how Katherine and Ethan had met, how a cowboy had saved a woman from death, and how that woman had given the cowboy a reason to live. It was a love story that would be passed down through generations of Turners, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best, that courage and compassion can change everything, and that true love, once found, never really dies. The ranch continued under the Turner family's care, and on quiet summer evenings, ranch hands would swear they could see 2 figures sitting on the hilltop, watching the sunset together, eternally young and eternally in love. And whether it was truth or legend or just the play of light and shadow on the mountainside, it didn't really matter. What mattered was the life they had built, the love they had shared, and the legacy they had left behind. What mattered was that on a desperate day in the New Mexico desert, when Katherine Sullivan was digging her own grave, Ethan Turner had found her, filled it in, and taken her away from danger toward a future brighter than either of them could have imagined. And in the end, that was everything.